back to business as usual. We've gotten past the holiday season, and now it feels like we're back to doing what we do every week, and every week. Certainly, that long time between Pentecost and the beginning of Advent, where every Sunday is green, and it seems like we're just marking the passage of time, can begin to feel very ordinary. And in fact, it's called, in some traditions, ordinary time, because the church likes to put strange meanings on familiar words. It doesn't mean ordinary in the sense of ho-hum, but rather ordinary, ordering time. But nonetheless, it can feel pretty ordinary, as can this time between the end of Epiphany and the beginning of Lent. But I want to suggest to you that it's not really that ordinary in any sense of the word. You may know that sometimes the church divides the calendar into two big chunks. There's one chunk that goes from Christmas to Easter. It's called the ceremonial season. There's another period that goes from Easter all the way around to sometime in Advent, which is ordinary. And we're meant to see that in the one season we are following along the life of Jesus. And in this season between Christmas and Easter, in that short time of 4 or 5 months and really no more, we hear the whole story of the life of Jesus, the life and ministry in a more or less chronological way. And so there's something extraordinary going on in these weeks that we're supposed to be paying attention to. Certainly you will have noticed, if you've been following along with the gospel, how quickly we have gone from the baby in the manger to Jesus being baptized to now Jesus beginning to collect his followers, so that we're headed already into Jesus' ministry. I think it's worth it to ask, what in the world is going on at this point in the story? What does it mean for us? What is God trying to tell us in this season of new light? It would be tempting, I think, to pull out any of the obvious lines from the gospel this morning. What are you looking for? Where are you staying? Come and see. And try to make a complete theological statement around any one of those lines. And preachers are tempted to do that. And I will reserve the right to do that in some other year, and you can remind me of it when I do. But for today, I'd like to suggest to you that maybe those lines are really just the things guys would say to each other when they met on the street anyway. Maybe they're not what we're meant to be seeing in the story. I think there are other words that are used that we really should be paying attention to, because they give us hints about what it is God is trying to do in us in this season. The first one that's worth noticing is rabbi. When James and John begin to follow Jesus, and he turns around and sees them walking behind them, and he asks, what are you looking for? They address him as rabbi, which is true, in a way. He is, in fact, a teacher. He is one who is unusually righteous and proclaims a certain sort of life of righteousness to anyone who will listen. So in a way, they're right, but really, he's more than that. If you notice, Jesus never, ever says, in my opinion, or I'm just thinking that, or any of the other things that might suggest that he's just giving his opinion, which is what a rabbi does. To this day, rabbinic opinions are given, couched in the context of everything else that's ever been said, presuming that they've read all these other rabbis' opinions that came before them and building on that precedent. And they're always offering their opinion as one faithful person who happens to be particularly learned, but not as anybody who speaks with authority. If you read all 4 of the Gospels, you will find that there are constantly people saying in amazed tones that Jesus speaks with a greater authority than a typical rabbi. This is God come among us. There's no veil between us. There's no mediation here. This is God speaking in Jesus. This isn't just someone offering an opinion. This is someone speaking the wisdom of God to us. And then a little later, we get the word Messiah. When James and John go to find Peter, they tell him, we have found the Messiah, which is a little funny because, in fact, they haven't found anything. Jesus has found them. But even so, Messiah is also only a partial revelation of what it is that is going on in the project that is Jesus. You may remember that when Israel was in captivity in Babylon, They were finally able to go back to Israel after Babylon was captured by Persia, was conquered by Persia. And so the king of Persia, Darius the Great, told these foreigners that they could go back to their own place. And as a result of this magnanimous gesture, the leadership of Israel gave Darius the Great the title Messiah. Messiah was used to describe anyone who came at a time when Israel was in a state of great distress or great need, when it needed to be delivered from something. And so almost anybody could be a Messiah if they delivered Israel from its distress. And yes, that is what Jesus is doing in us, delivering us from that distress. But it's more than that. This is not just any garden variety person coming to solve political problems. Both of these things are things that the world might like to say, that's all we know about Jesus and all we need to know. It will be very convenient and comfortable sometimes, and even for us, if we're honest with ourselves, to say that Jesus is mainly a righteous teacher, someone who tells us how to live an ethical life. It's easy to know what pigeonhole to put Jesus into if that's all that he does for us. We can ignore all of the embarrassing metaphysical stuff, all the complicated suffering that appears to attach to God that can be so embarrassing when we're trying to explain our faith to anyone else. If all Jesus is a teacher, well, that's easy enough to understand. There's lots of those. Messiah works pretty well for the world, too. The world understands power. The world understands what it means to come and bring force to solve problems. If that's all that Jesus is for, well, okay, we can understand political power. We can understand might making right and all those things the world likes to say. Once again, it allows us to ignore the fact that this Messiah is pretty humble, comes with no visible power. What are we to make of this? I think there's more to it than just teacher. There's more to it than just savior. There's something going on here that is a project of God in the world that is meant to be not just about people then, but people now. It's about to be you and me in our lives. How new light comes into our lives, how God comes in person into the world and transforms everything, including you and me, shines a new light on us so that we need not be embarrassed to be seen in a new light. There's very little, I think, in the gospel this morning that helps us to get much further than that. But as luck would have it, we're reading from the Gospel of John. I just happen to have with me the prologue of the Gospel of John. I think this tells us something about what it is that all this is supposed to mean. So I know you all have this memorized, but just to remind you what it says. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. Light, grace, truth, glory. These words appear again and again in this early part of John, and they're telling us what the project of God is really about. It's really about completely transforming everything through the power of God. Not just coming with a nice message of how to behave. Not just coming with a message of how the powers of this world might be overcome and made more just. but about the radical reorganizing of the world through the power of God. That would be enough to see in any season of the year. It certainly is enough to see here. And I could sit down and say amen at this point, and we could all go away happy and edified, and our lives would not have to be changed in any way. But I'm very grateful to one of my colleagues who spent most of her career preaching, "How then shall we live?" So the good news and the bad news is, dear friends, there is more, and the more is how we're supposed to live as a consequence of everything that we hear in this gospel story, and indeed in every piece of the story of Jesus that comes to us through the year. There are three things I think we need to know about how we're supposed to live. The first is, I think we have to live creatively. The first thing that Peter gets from Jesus when he's introduced to him is a new name. This is not uncommon. People in the Bible are often getting new names. You may have gotten a new name when you were confirmed. It's not uncommon when people are ordained or when they become members of religious orders to take on a new name. Well, it may be that you and I are also being called today to take on new names. It might not be John or Mary or Athanasius or whatever you happen to like. The new name may be teacher or healer, helper. The new name may be friend. It may be flower arranger or altar guild person or greeter, or it could be anything. The beauty of this season is that it may be something we're not even expecting. There are times when the name has always been in us, it's just been hidden, and then by the grace of God somehow it's excavated and revealed, and suddenly we realize it was always there. Other times it's something that comes completely out of left field and surprises us. We would never have guessed. Indeed, we had no inkling that it was ever there. That, dear friends, is surely the way we should feel now, 3 weeks after Christmas. This was God's new name coming out of left field to be among us. Maybe this is the season to be looking to see what that new name is that may be hiding someplace in each of us. Maybe we need a little help. Maybe now is the time to ask someone you trust, what's the new name that's waiting in me? Maybe somebody else has already seen it. It's just waiting to be asked. The second thing, and one you've heard me say before, and you will be sick of hearing me say it by the time I'm done saying it, is we have to live expectantly. One wonders if James and John would have believed what John the Baptist said about Jesus if they had not been expecting it. If those early followers had not been trained to expect that God was going to act in the world, would they even have noticed when Jesus came walking by? Would they have believed what it was that John said about Jesus? I'm not sure they would have. I'm not sure we would. If we're not living expectantly, how can we possibly hope to notice when God does act? Because in the wisdom of God, God is going to act in your life and my life. We're certain of that. What remains uncertain is whether we will be there to notice it at the time. If we're willing to live expectantly, if we're willing to live a life that's built around the confidence, not even the expectation, the sure faith that God is going to do something through you and through me, perhaps there's just a chance that we'll notice it when it really does happen. The third thing is that we have to live fearlessly. When the early disciples began to follow Jesus, they turned their backs on John. They left John and began to follow Jesus. There was no going back. Once they had become convinced of who Jesus was and what Jesus was about, they couldn't go back to where they were before of, well, God's going to do this sooner or later. They had to believe that God had done it there in their sight. The same is true for you and for me. Whenever the new light is shined on some part of our lives, there are going to be things that are thrown into darkness. There are going to be things we're going to have to leave behind in order to go in the new direction that God is calling us to go. That's not easy. The old things are comfortable. They're familiar. It may be the devil that we know, but at least they're the devil we know. Are we willing to be fearless enough to go where God is calling us? I hope so. I hope that somehow in these weeks of Epiphany, which is long this year, we will have that experience, each one of us, at some point of that new light shining into each of us, calling us to some new work, some new name, calling us to notice God working in our lives and in the lives of others, calling us to follow where God leads without worry for what it is that we're leaving behind, without worry for what it is that we have to give up. In all these ways, dear friends, we also will be doing what Jesus' early followers were doing, turning our faces toward the new light, following where it is that God leads. Amen.